If this isn't the final nail in the coffin for the theory of evolution, I don't know what is.
I'll agree that you don't know what one is.
The website Tech Times published an article online not too long ago entitled Massive Genetic Study Reveals 90% of Earth's Animals Appeared at the Same Time. Where do I remember reading that? Oh yeah, Genesis chapter 1 verses 20 through 31. It talks about the 5th and 6th days of creation week. I'm not going to read it because it's kind of long, so feel free to read it for yourself. You can actually read the Bible for free online at BibleGateway.com. But on the 5th day of creation week, God created all of the marine life and birds. And on the 6th day, God created all land animals and humans.
Don't forget that Genesis 1 has trees, birds, and other assorted animals being created before humans, and with multiple men and women being created together at the same time. But then Genesis 2 has only one man alone being created before trees, birds, or other animals, and then one single woman being created after all of that.
Back to the article from Tech Times. It says, landmark new research that involves analyzing millions of DNA barcodes has debunked much about what we know today about the evolution of species. Yeah, because it never happened.
Yes, it definitely did, and is still happening now, and that can be verified, but many different ways, both in the present and in the past. And I would be happy to help anyone who's confused about that. I can show you all the data you'll ever need to see to understand that evolution is real and that creationism is nothing but lies.
The article says, in a massive genetic study, senior research associate at the Program for the Human Environment at Rockefeller University, Mark Stokel, and University of Basel geneticist David Thaler discovered that virtually 90% of all animals on Earth appeared at right around the same time. Surprise, surprise. Science confirms the Bible.
No, it doesn't. Ever. Joining me today is evolutionary biologists Dr. Daniel Stern Cardinal and Dr. Zach B. Hancock. And Hancock, as I understand it, is also doing population genetics, so that'll be especially relevant in this study. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Have you both seen the video from Bible Flockbox? Okay.
Yes.
Have you both seen the study in, what was it, Tech Times that says, I have to give you his title. What was the title of his video where it says a massive genetic study proves the Bible or some such crap? Yeah, proves the Bible is true. And this is based on a Tech Times study that said massive genetic study reveals 90% of Earth's animals appeared at the same time, which is as dubious a claim as I can think of. But again, I've learned not to get my science news from the popular press. I don't want to trust any reporter's interpretation of the study that they may or may not have read properly. I've seen too many times where that goes awry. What do you have to say?
Yeah, as a general rule, I hate how science is reported outside of scientific publications. It just goes through this game of telephone where you go from the journal to Scientific American to the New York Times science pages, and it just gets worse and worse and worse as you do that, and more sensational, and it's terrible. And always go to the original source.
I remember reading one article that was a reporter's analysis of something that was going on some Lake Morrow or something in California that had a high level of arsenic in it. And so that they were finding organisms that were living in this very toxic lake. And so it is remarkable that they find these organisms living in this very toxic lake. Okay, that's fine. That's decent. But then there were two problems with that. And one of them was that somebody made the claim that that these organisms were incorporating the arsenic into their DNA, and so so that the four codons, one of them has been replaced with arsenic. I can't remember which one. And then the other statement that came from that article was that this was a life form that was unrelated to anything else on the planet. So a second or completely independent abiogenesis event. Both profound claims, both of them bullshit, And at least part of it came from the reporter's misunderstanding. And everything I've read on the article we're talking about today is the same sort of scenario.
Yeah, and this article it's actually a little worse than that, in that the article itself is particularly bad. So when you start off with an article that's published in a journal that's not even classified with impact factors and that is privately published, and that is not like a journal represented by any scientific society, and then it has downstream effects through journalists and then finally to creationists, it can only get worse from there. And so it's this sort of a domino effect where you already started off in a really bad place, and it's just terrible at the end.
Let me just read what the actual claim is according to the original study. It says phenotypically neutral variants are only subject to democratic processes, drift, lineage sorting, genetic hitchhiking, and bottlenecks, with that last word being important. And then later on it says several convergent lines of evidence show that mitochondrial diversity in modern humans follows from sequence uniformity, followed by the accumulation of largely neutral diversity during a population expansion that began approximately 100,000 years ago. Note, it doesn't say that the species appeared 100,000 years ago. It says that there was a population expansion that appeared that long. And that matches other data that we already have. A straightforward hypothesis is that the extant populations of almost all animal species have arrived at a similar result, consequent to a similar process of expansion from mitochondrial uniformity within the last 1 to 200,000 years. So, rather than the species appearing all at the same time, all of them went on migration routes at some point between 100,000 years and 200,000 years, meaning somewhere in the range of 100,000 years, and there were already species on the planet before all that happened.
Yeah, they're kind of at the macro level. There's three problems with what the creationists do with this paper, and this paper is at least in the circles that I'm familiar with within kind of the broader field of evolutionary biology, this actual paper that this is based on is like famously bad in a number of ways. But the kind of the misunderstandings that creationists lean on, there's kind of three problems here. The first is, and this is putting aside the problems with the original paper, this is taking that at face value and just what are the problems with how creationists use it. First is that what we're looking for are what's called the most recent common ancestors for all these different groups of species. And that does not tell you when the species originated. That's just coalescent back in time, but that's not origination. That's coalescence. That's a different thing. Second thing is that coalescent time doesn't tell you that the population was like 1 or 2. It wasn't, nobody else around. It wasn't like, poof, 2 created individuals or 2 got off the ark and then everyone else expanded from there. There was a big population there. It doesn't even have to be a bottleneck that we're going back to. You just have these evolutionary processes. And then the third thing, of course, is they're engaging in the classic creationist strategy of cherry picking, because while they love to lean on the fact that these authors talked about bottlenecks and they go, oh, everything went through a bottleneck at the same time. But what do you never hear the creationists engage with? That the same time was 1 to 200,000 years ago, not 4,500 years ago. Just leave that out. So they like some of the techniques, but then they're just going to ignore some of the findings because those are inconvenient. At the macro level, those are the big three problems. It's misunderstanding what we mean when we're working backwards to our most recent common ancestor, and then just tossing out the time aspect to it entirely because they don't like that.
I had a conversation with a young Earth creationist, a famous one once upon a time, where he was trying to cite for me this study that showed that that mitochondrial Eve was dated to 6,000 years ago. And what he was doing was that you have this range, the furthest being hundreds of thousands of years and most recent to be 6,000 years, and these were the outliers on the average. So go as far away from the average to either extreme as you can, and you get 6,000 years. The same study also confirmed that mitochondrial Eve lived in Africa, and he rejected that part of the data because he wasn't going to have an ancestor in Africa for suspicious reasons.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the creationist misunderstandings are, I would just add to Dan's that They also completely ignore that when you look through the paper, there are phylogenies shown with relationships between species. And those relationships are deeper than 100 to 200,000 years. They're just talking about the ancestor within the species is 100 to 200,000. But if you look at all the phylogenies they include, there's a bunch of different phylogenies with millions of years of ancestry across individuals. So like they don't even mention that those are different things that they're talking about.
And then there's a number of other points that are brought up by the by the guy that made the video that's misquoting all this. I guess we should finish destroying the misunderstanding on that before I get to that, though. Now, one of the things that I read, I found another article that said, let me see, what was it? Did 90% of animal species appear at the same time as human beings? And of course, the answer is a resounding no. And it says a follow-up article published at the same website oversimplified and misportrayed the conclusions of the paper. The study's most startling result, perhaps, is that 9 out of 10 species on Earth today, including humans, came into being 100,000 to 200,000 years ago. And it was this mischaracterization of the original research that kicked off a firestorm of reactions, primarily among critics of evolution, which is a very polite way of saying reality deniers.
Yeah. We're also missing the fact that like there's no method section in the original paper. I don't actually know how many species they compared. I don't know how they did the comparisons. They have a couple of figures in which they show, broad scale species groups, but it's definitely not 90% of organisms or even 90% of like groups of families of organisms. And so I'm super confused on where they're getting this massive genetic study of hundreds of thousands of individuals. There's no method section in the original paper. I don't know what they did or how they're doing their comparisons, or even like they use this metric called average percent difference. I don't know what that means. I don't know if it's standardized by number of individuals. I don't know if it's supposed to be genetic diversity like pi or like Waterson's theta. Like there's a bunch of like summary statistics for summarizing genetic diversity, and average percent difference is not one of them.
Not one of them.
So I don't know what they mean by that, and I don't know how we're comparing that across species and across different sample sizes. So like that's like one of the big and again, one of the problems here is that the original paper is so bad that it's hard to like even address creationist critiques without talking about all of the misconceptions the original paper had.
Yeah, I've seen an awful lot of criticisms from it, and I tried to highlight them all. And I'm not going to bore everybody by trying to read all of the rebuttals that I've seen in science articles. I'm just going to post a couple of them in the description. One of the things that I find interesting in this interpretation, one is to just throw out the 100,000 years, right? They just ignore it, and because they say it's a religious bias. Whenever anything adheres to the fact, that's called a bias. And another thing, according to religious believers, our facts are just opinions. It's their opinions that are facts.
Yeah, with the 100,000 years in this video, at some point, kind of towards the end, I think, he kind of does like a little parenthetical aside. He's like, of course they say it was 100,000 years ago, but we know that's wrong because we have our interpretation of the Bible. It's like, well, you just spent 4 minutes talking about how great this paper was. Now it confirms the Bible. Now we're just gonna like, also, I'm like,
Yeah, it's like those silly scientists, they're getting closer and closer. Maybe
they're getting that actually, thank you, Zach. That reminds me, he conflates the origin of life with this, the events that are documented in the paper. Whatever you think about what the paper says, they're not documenting the origin of life, right? They're talking about diversification of a specific group of species. Mm-hmm. Whereas the guy in the video, he's now saying, well, they used to say it was 4 billion years ago, and now they say it's 100,000 years ago. So at least they're getting closer. Those are two different things, sir. Those are not the same thing.
I saw an article by Cy Gart, who is a Christian biologist. And he wrote that, no, the reported study did not imply that 90% of the Earth's animals appeared at the same time. And he went in and he explained that the Tech Times article completely misunderstood the original paper. It does not claim that 90% of animal species began at the same time 100,000 years ago, and it in no way is supportive of young Earth creationism. Instead, he says that the little variation reported among mitochondrial DNA is attributable to genetic bottlenecks of migration. That's coming from another Christian, but of course they're going to dismiss it because he's not a true Christian, because he hasn't bought into all the same lies as this other group did.
One other aspect to this paper that I think gets kind of swept under the rug when you hear it talked about, more broadly, and in particular with like non-scientist creationists when they want to misuse this paper, they leave out the fact that they're doing this thing. It's based on this technique called DNA barcoding, which uses a teeny little fraction of the mitochondrial genome, which is itself a teeny fraction of the DNA you find in human cells. So
isn't it isolating a single gene that's common through all of your test sample animals?
It's cytochrome oxidase 1, and it's about 350 to 600 base pairs long. So it's very small, and it's a protein coding gene. So it's a strongly conserved protein coding gene.
Strongly conserved, for the lay people in the audience, means there's little reason for it to change ever at all. So it's always going to be pretty much the same in every animal to begin with.
Yeah, it's going to be very similar. And to put that in perspective, in terms of just thinking about like the sampling size we're using in terms of the fraction of nucleotides we could actually use to compare, we're looking at, Zach, what was it, 300 to 600 out of the mitochondrial DNA, which is itself about 16,000. In contrast to
the species, but yeah.
In contrast to the nuclear genome for humans is 3 billion for a haploid genome. So we're several orders of magnitude here in terms of what we're not looking at compared to what we are looking at. So again, putting aside the creationist stuff, going back to the original paper, like, is it appropriate to draw these grand conclusions based on this one highly constrained gene that represents a teeny tiny little fraction of all of the inherited DNA in all of these different species?
Yeah, and it's also inherited as a single unit that's non-recombining, that is haploid, that is clonal, right? And so there's this additional weirdness to the mitochondria that doesn't exist in the rest of the nuclear genome that, for one, reduces its like population size, right? The population size of the mitochondria is a half of the nuclear genome, and so it's going to coalesce more rapidly because it has a smaller effective size. So like there's a lot of like weirdness to the mitochondria that make it not particularly ideal for like uncovering broad patterns across populations.
One of the things that I got out of this, I mean, the study found that 9 out of 10 current animal species appeared 100,000 to 200,000 years ago. If that were true, which we've already established that it's not, but the guy doing the video and the people, the creationists, Answers in Genesis, and all these other, science denying religious freaks that are seizing on this have to admit that this means not only that life, that all of these species came not at the same time, but at some point between 100,000 and 200,000 years ago, but also that 1% of current species appeared at some other time. And that's going to be difficult to fit into their creation standpoint. I read an article that said that because the way that they'd done this, that if cheetahs were one of the examples it had, because there's so much of a genetic bottleneck with cheetahs, that using the same method, it would have resulted with the cheetahs having come into existence 12,000 years ago.
Yeah. I in graduate school, I worked on amphipod crustaceans. I did these sort of coalescence analysis using mitochondria. In fact, using the CO1, and their coalescent ancestor was 2.5 million years ago. So that was one of the percent that wouldn't have fit into this time frame at all. So I don't know. They didn't go through the bottleneck, I guess.
Yeah.
I have another question, since you do population genetics. I've had people ask me recently whether we can be sure that every ethnic deme eventually derives from Africa, or did certain groups of people evolve from different sources, which I guess is polygenism.
Yeah,
which I thought had died out in Darwin's day.
It would be nice if it had died out in Darwin's day. There's a particular section of society that still holds on to these sorts of racist ideas. No, we can be very sure. And in fact, I think it was in 2022, one of the largest studies that used over 3,000 human genomes, including a dozen ancient genomes from all around the world, found that all the evidence suggested coalescence into Africa. And that indicates that all the longest branches within the human tree derive from Africa. So there's absolutely no evidence of like multiple ancestry or multiple originations of different human groups. There's just
or of different locations for origination. Everything points to Africa. Yes,
they all coalesce in a very specific place in East Africa.
Mhm.
So I got another question. Answers in Genesis recently posted a thing for Darwin Day last week, wherein they said that if we knew about genetics what we know today back in Darwin's day, then none of Darwin's ideas would have even been considered. I am unaware of any genomic study of multiple species that does anything other than confirm and corroborate common ancestry for every genome that's ever been sampled. Is there an exception study anywhere ever that contradicts evolution?
No, never. I mean, the only time when Darwin's theory was ever in contest was before we knew about the mechanism of inheritance. Once we rediscovered Mendelian's law, like Mendel's laws, and we understood how inheritance works and population genetics integrated natural selection with the modes of inheritance, there has never been any doubt that evolution, for one, is true and that natural selection is the sole driver of adaptation.
And since you do the population genetics, then I'm keen to ask you another question. I am often referring to phylogenetic charts that implement the molecular clock, showing like one of my favorite charts that I often refer to is the number of or the diversification of eutherian mammals toward and then after the Cretaceous Paleogene impact. So we already have a lot of according to this chart and the study associated with it, we already have a lot of these divisions happening just before that cataclysmic impact, and then of course further divisions thereafter. And the way that they did the molecular clock and everything, it exactly matches very closely what we see in the fossil record.
Yeah,
I mean, profoundly. And I see study after study like that. Do you have any familiarity with studies like this?
Yeah, I've used molecular clocks before. And what's really nice about like sort of modern molecular phylogenetics is we're actually capable of integrating both fossil evidence with genetic evidence. And so we take sort of a holistic approach to understanding and to timing divergences. But generally, when you look at molecular clocks, you're looking for very specific patterns. You're looking for a linear accumulation of genetic divergence with time. And we calibrate time by the fossil record. And so if you see that linear accumulation of divergence, then you know the molecular clock assumptions are satisfied. And consistently, we find this is pretty justified at very deep phylogenetic times. So the molecular clock very, very often will corroborate the paleontological record.
Thank you. The only time I've ever seen it, I've never seen it contradict evolution, but I have seen it correct morphology. I can think of a couple of times when it was thought that Megachiroptera and Microchiroptera were like convergent lineages, and then they were unified as a monophyletic group, or when it was thought that a handful of mammals had all lost their teeth and all eat ants, and that must have been a common trait or a derived synapomorphy, and then they realized that aardvarks, the genome comes back and says no. The African or the South American anteater is the only true Xenarthran, and the pangolin surprisingly is more closely related to carnivores.
Yeah.
And
that happens.
There are these really fun. There are these really
fun. And then aardvarks, the third one, are aphrotheres. They're more closely related to elephants, and so none of them were closely related to each other at all.
Yeah.
But it's interesting when you have these morphologies, and you can rely on them most of the time.
Yeah.
But then when you get the genome, that's the Maury Povich moment. You are the father. That's that's the conclusive thing we're looking for.
I think what's really exciting is there are these fun exceptions, right, in which the morphology and the genomics don't match up. But it's actually kind of remarkable how often they do match up, and that a lot of our systematic hypotheses, long before we knew anything about genomics, are still pretty much in place and are still justified at broad scales, which is like kind of a pretty exciting thing when you're thinking about like connections between genotype and phenotype. That what we think we're understanding about comparative anatomy is very often correct and is justified using genomics.
I was just on a show a couple of days ago where people were asking me how do they do all these fine points of how do you tell the difference between a Brontosaurus and a Apatosaurus? One of the studies that we came up with, because they revised Brontosaurus because of the way that they had miscategorized it way back in the day. And so the original fossil that they had that they once called Brontosaurus that they realized later was Apatosaurus, they have all these others that are called Apatosaurus, and they realized, no, these are all similar to each other. The first one, that got the Brontosaurus name is actually significantly different. So we're changing the name back to Brontosaurus. But these people were asking me how they do all of these fine points. I mean, because you're talking about in some of these animals, very subtle distinctions.
Yeah.
In the shapes of whatever bones that we have. And I said, okay, well, some of them use Bayesian techniques, some of them use maximum parsimony, but most of the time those match each other. And even when they don't, when we can get the genome, there we know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And one of kind of related to this, just going back to kind of the more recent timescales, one of my favorite studies on this is looking at the human mitochondrial DNA. It's a study from 2009. And what they did is they were able to corroborate specific mitochondrial haplotypes. So very specific sequences in the mitochondrial DNA that are geographically limited. And they were able to associate those with specific times that are either within recorded human history or in the well-documented archaeological records. So stuff within, in some cases, 30 to 40,000 years ago. And in other cases, within the last 1,500, 2,000, 3,000 years ago, things like settling remote islands. And they're able to look at the mitochondrial differences between the island population and the adjacent mainland population. And basically, draw those dots and then draw the exact curve that you would predict based on the accumulation of mutations that we had already kind of said this is the rate that we expect. And then you drop those data points in there and they line up exactly with what you would expect. It's a really well-constructed study. I like that one a lot.
I'm not surprised though, mainly because I've been reading and studying the Bible for over 15 years, and it says God created all living things by the power of His Word. He spoke all life into existence. That's why animals appeared at around the same time.
So you believe that a supernatural being, that's what magical means, by the way, supernatural. You believe that a supernatural / magical being used an incantation to speak everything out of nothing. Yet, even though we atheists consider that there was never a time when there was just nothing, you guys are constantly accusing us of believing everything came from nothing when that's actually what you believe.
They didn't evolve, they were created. The article goes on to read, more specifically, they found out that 9 out of 10 animal species on the planet came to being at the same times as humans did some 100,000 to 200,000 years ago.
Except that that's not at all what that said, and we've already gone over that. And one of the other things that you have to understand is that they're talking about current species, and they're not talking about the species that pre-existed those, nor are they talking about the people that pre-existed those. Because if you're only talking about the people that are alive today, all people that are alive today can be traced back to a mitochondrial Eve roughly 100,000 years ago. But if you went back 10,000 years, now you're going to have a larger sample or a different sample that goes back a little bit further. They're not all going to trace to the same person because it wasn't just one person. The mitochondrial Eve lived in a population of other people. And Y chromosome Adam also probably never met mitochondrial Eve because they lived 150,000 years apart, according to these estimates. And if you go back, as I said, if you go back 10,000 years, 20,000 years, grab all these different people, then they're going to trace back to a further person. And that's how that works. So it's not at any point talking about animals appearing out of nothing at any time.
Pretty much like it says on the 6th day of creation week, except for the 100,000 to 200,000 years.
Whenever I show examples of evolution, the Bible believers want to say, well, that's just microevolution. Okay. Show me microcreation. Can you do that without, say, pulling a rabbit out of a hat? Is there any other way to show? No? Because can you show me that there's any truth to your bullshit at all?
The Bible indicates that we were created around 6,000 years ago. That's because Luke chapter 3 verses 23 through 38 lists the genealogy of Jesus Christ all the way back to Adam. And when you do the math, that adds up to around 4,000 years. And since Jesus lived about 2,000 years ago, that comes to a total of about 6,000 years.
The problem with that, one of many problems with that, is that there are multiple genealogies for Jesus just in the Bible, and They can't all be true at the same time. So the Bible contradicts itself there. That's one of the problems. Another one of the problems is that if you do by Bishop Ussher's method of counting all these generations back, what you end up with doing that same math would put the global flood of Noah's Ark, which we know did not really happen. But if you go by Ussher's math and you believe in the Bible, then that would have put the Noah's flood at the same time as Sargon of Akkad, for example. There were known events in history. We already have pharaohs in Egypt. We know what history was going on in different parts of the world at the point that it was supposed to be flooded. This is using the exact same mathematic techniques as Bishop Ussher did, because how would he know when these other ancient events were going on?
So life on this planet did not begin about 100,000 to 200,000 years ago.
That's not what they're saying at all. And life began on this planet almost 4 billion years ago. But the study that you're talking about doesn't talk about when species come into existence. It talks about species migrations, according to this one part of this one, the mitochondrial DNA. So yeah, expansions and bottlenecks, and that's all, and not the origin of everything all at once.
I know there will be some people in the comments that will criticize the Bible because the dates for the origin of life don't match the article I'm reading. But keep in mind that evolutionists have traditionally claimed that life began over 3 billion years ago. So I see this as a step closer to the truth. Let's give them credit. At least they're making progress.
You're not. You're going backwards.
The article goes on to talk about the COI gene, which is used to create DNA barcodes. And it says, in analyzing the COI of 100,000 species, Stokel and Thaler arrived at the conclusion that most animals appeared simultaneously.
No, they didn't.
No, they didn't.
They analyzed the gene of 100,000 species. That must have taken countless hours to do, maybe even months or years. Not to mention the cost. I mean, somebody has to pay researchers for their time, right? Yet when you open the Bible and read about 5 minutes into the first page, it tells you practically the same thing. Somebody should tell secular scientists that. It will save them a lot of time and money.
Fantasy, folklore, myths, and legends. Basement stacks, take the stairs.
Thank you.
Listen to this though. It just gets better. They found that the neutral mutation across species were not as varied as expected. Neutral mutation refers to the slight DNA changes that occur across generations. They can be compared to tree rings because they can tell how old a certain species or individual is. As to how that could have happened, it's unclear. A likely possibility is the occurrence of a sudden event that caused large-scale environmental trauma and wiped out majority of Earth's species. Remind you of anything? Maybe a global flood?
Except that no, it's not a global flood. It's different animal groups going on migration, as was happening quite a lot during that 100,000 year period. We know for absolutely certain that there was not a global flood. Not only is there no evidence for such a flood, but the evidence against it is absolutely overwhelming. It's not just that it couldn't happen, and it couldn't happen, but we have proof that it didn't happen, even if it could have. So not even a flurry of miracles is going to save that story.
In the book of Genesis, chapter 6 and 7, it tells us that God decided to destroy mankind with a flood because people became completely corrupt and the earth was filled with violence. The only people that were spared was Noah and his family. The reason being is because Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord, according to Genesis chapter 6, verse 8.
No, that story was based on King Ziusudra, who survived a flood of the Euphrates River at Shuruppak while he was in a coracle taking his livestock to market, and it was flooded into the Persian Gulf. Every version of the story that happens before the version we eventually get in Genesis, and there's at least a half a dozen different versions of them, all of them reference Ubartutu, or they reference Shuruppak, or they mention Ziusudra by name. So we know, and all of these other details are peripheral things, about the releasing of the dove or the raven, and the depth of the flood, which was supposed to be. 15 cubits. Well, geologists and archaeologists have confirmed that the city of Shuruppak was flooded at that time by a depth of 22 feet, which translates to 15 cubits. Go figure. And that would have obscured everything in the Iraqi floodplain.
Bible-believing Christians have been criticized for years and still get criticized by secular society and God-hating scientists for believing these things.
No, it's not God-hating scientists. We don't hate your magic imaginary friend. It's just that we hate lies, and your God is a lie. So that's kind of peripheral. If we care about the truth, then we're not going to say things are true unless we can show the truth of it. And we've noticed that faith is all about pretending to know things you don't know, which means that a person of faith must lie to themselves and other people in order to maintain belief. At least when you're doing religious apologetics, as you are right now.
Yet now we have irrefutable scientific evidence that confirms the Bible.
Except that we've already refuted it, and it never confirmed the Bible.
Actually, there already is a whole lot of irrefutable scientific evidence in support of the Bible's account of creation, so this just adds to that.
No, there's not one actual fact that is verifiably true, that is also positively indicative of creationism, nor that is contradicting of evolution. Nothing, not one. I've made several challenges, all unanswered, to produce something, anything that actually positively promotes creationism or contradicts evolution. Y'all ain't got nothing.
Not to mention, just take a look around. Nothing is evolving.
Nothing except everything, because there's no way to stop evolution. Everything evolves all the time. We have new variants, new cultivars, new breeds, new demes, new forms are emerging all the time. Life is entirely fluid. It never stops.
It never has evolved. If evolution were true, then we should be able to see intermediate species all around us.
And we do see intermediate species all throughout the fossil record, and some of them are even still alive. We have intermediate species that are still alive, but we've got thousands of them just among vertebrates alone. Again, if you'd like to see lists, if you'd like to talk about any of them to show why they are transitional, why they definitely are transitional, even according to the strictest definition of that term, I'd be happy to show you.
An intermediate species would be a step in the evolutionary process, like a half human and a half ape.
Except that a half human, half ape is as stupid as saying a half duck, half bird, because of course ducks are birds, just like humans are apes. An ape is any member of the taxonomic superfamily Hominoidea, and that includes humans. So if you want to say stupid things like a half dachshund, half dog, or a half collie, half dog, it's the same thing, because collies are dogs. Would you say a half cat, half lion, or half lion, half cat? It's the same thing. Lions are cats. Humans are apes.
But instead, what do we see? We see clear distinction between kinds of life.
Except that there's no such thing as a kind. There's no distinctions between kinds because there's no kinds. But if you try to identify what a kind is, if you tried to name 3 separate kinds, we're going to see that there are no distinctions between them. I defy you. That's the Phylogeny challenge. It's been up for a dozen years or so. And again, not answered. It's the pivotal question that creationists must answer if there was any truth to their position at all whatsoever. And y'all won't even try.
For example, there is a clear distinction between humans, apes, cats, dogs, birds, and so on.
Except that humans are apes, and there is thus no distinction.
And this is exactly what we would expect if the Bible were true. For instance, Genesis chapter 1 verse 24 says, "And God said, Let the earth bring forth the living creature after his kind, cattle and creeping thing and beast of the earth after his kind. And it was so."
It's too bad that passage actually promotes or allows for biological evolution completely. So there are leading biologists who are Christians, and they endorse that passage because it promotes evolution. It doesn't speak against it. It speaks for it.
In other words, different forms of life reproduce after their kind. Therefore, you're not going to get a mouse if you mate two dogs.
Likewise, if you have new species emerge, like Ken Ham of Answers in Genesis and Kent Hovind, Creation Science Ministries, all that, they admit that speciation does happen. And that is when, according to the biological species concept, these species can no longer interbreed to produce fertile hybrids. They've grown so far apart genetically that they can't bring forth after their kind anymore. Look at all the different species of foxes, which some people have said are the same kind, or are they the same kind as dogs? Who knows what a kind is? Nobody can define it, so we'll never know. But we know several species of dogs that can't interbreed with each other, and none of them can interbreed with foxes. Are they the same kind? Are they not the same kind? Whatever they are, they can't bring forth after their kind. You can't put a fox and a dog together and have it produce something viable. So how could they be the same kind? You can't put certain species of dogs together and do that either. So your whole narrative of what a kind is falls apart.
There's more to the article from Tech Times. I'll leave a link to it in the video description if you'd like to read it in its entirety.
And I'll include links to scientific rebuttals correcting misunderstood misrepresentations of that article.
It does have an evolutionary bias, but it's fascinating to see that scientists are being confronted with strong evidence that refutes evolution and confirms the Bible, even if they don't want to admit it.
Just because it's not true. I'm not going to admit anything that isn't true. It takes faith to believe things that aren't true. As a matter of fact, I think that's how faith is defined.
The things that you're liable to read in the Bible, it ain't necessary.